Welcome to the History in Motion podcast. This is a podcast for people who want history with context, not shortcuts. Every episode, we explore how people, power, and ideas collide, and why the past still shapes the world we're living in today. Not just what happened, but why it mattered. And if you've ever felt like history is either oversimplified or buried under great detail, you're in the right place. I'm Richie, and along with Paul, we're here to help you slow history down just enough to really understand it. Let's get into today's episode.
But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend by every means at our command.
When Xerxes I inherited the Persian throne in 486 BCE, he ruled the largest empire the ancient world had ever known, once already stabilized by his father Darius. His reign would not test the creation of empire, but its limits, how power is projected, how authority is perceived, and how memory is shaped by those who record history. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we examine Xerxes beyond caricature, as an imperial ruler navigating rebellion, ambition, and the constraints of scale.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are wrapping up our journey into ancient Persia with Xerxes I. And now you may be wondering, we just did Cyrus the Great, we did Darius the Great, and we did Xerxes the nothing. Maybe not so good, not so great. Well, there's some reasons for that, but I think he's definitely a massive player on the stage of everything Persia. And if you know anything about him, that he's going to play a very big role in a lot of these Greek and Persian battles that really stand the test of time. And that's where most of us know him from, and most of our sources come from that. And we'll get into that in a bit. But Rich, I'm really excited for this because I think we came in, probably the both of us, right? Like our understanding is very much the Greek sources, the movie 300, which again, not real history, but for me, that was my first introduction to who Xerxes was when I watched it as a kid. So this is a bit of, hey, let's set the narrative right, because I think as we've read with historians over the last maybe 2, 3, 4 decades, they've really started to get a proper picture of what Xerxes is without necessarily going through much of a Greek bias and, really just taking what Herodotus tells us, on face value.
Yeah, and I think these last couple episodes that we've done on the Persian Empire have been kind of uniquely fascinating for me, because I often struggle with ancient history. Again, it's ancient. It's hard to kind of relate to from a very modern perspective. And I think often we rely on so many outwardly resources about, what the history of this empire was, because sometimes people didn't record things the way we often expect them to. And it really does kind of drive at the heart of the question, not to get too philosophical because we are a history podcast, but what is history? And how many different forms and shapes it can take. And I think there's a lot of great historians in this field who are doing some really incredible work to understand Persian history from the view of the Persian Empire, not just what others had to say about the Persian Empire. And I think it's something that probably a lot of amateur historians or people who are just interested in history might take for granted, because, who has the time to look at the historiography of what different historians of Persian history are saying. But I think being able to go through Cyrus, Darius, and now Xerxes really does paint for us a very unique picture of how these rulers actually led from a Persian perspective.
100%. And I think that's the exciting part of all of this. It's weird because this history is 2,500 years old. Like Xerxes is born in 519 BC, but it almost feels a little bit like new and fresh because historians are taking these different approaches. There's all this archaeological work that's happened throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st century around some of these incredible sites within modern day Iran. So you're seeing a lot of interesting stuff coming out of this. But coming into this, I would say the main popular way of looking at Xerxes is the way he's been portrayed as brash, arrogant, obsessive over luxury, thinking of himself as a god, and almost this brat child of Darius, of just really emotional and just kind of a man-child in a lot of ways, and then kind of obsessed with all this luxury, not a great ruler. And if you look at the history of where all these sources are coming from, you see even through the last few hundred years, you see some biographies come out that are really along these lines. You even see back many, many years ago in as plays will come up and dramas about Xerxes, and they all portray him in this way because I think it does provide a very good literary tool to kind of show this character. But it all comes back to Herodotus, and we've talked about Herodotus on the last 2 episodes, and he is the source for us on a lot of these things. He has such a great detailed history of Xerxes and everything that kind of happens within Greece. And he's actually writing in and around the times, a little bit after Xerxes, but he's talking to people who were alive and either interacted with him or were at these battles. He's got the ability to hear a lot of these things. But again, he's getting a lot of these things secondhand. But ultimately, the most important thing with Herodotus, the battles and the death and destruction that the Persians bring to the Greeks is fresh in everybody's mind. And so you have to take that into account when we're reading Herodotus, because he's Greek. And he's talking to a lot of Greeks, and they're not happy with the Persians. We're going to see cities burned. We're going to see a lot of dead Greeks, and they're going to put it at Xerxes' feet versus Darius, who, hey, he came in, they had the Battle of Marathon, we won pretty easy, so it wasn't a big deal, and we're going to put him in a nice light. But Xerxes, he's the one that brought a lot of these things, so you're going to start to see a lot of stories and a lot of this portrayal in a negative light, which there's always a grain of truth into everything, but you're definitely going to see that bias, and I think that's what we've been talking about, is how historians have been doing a really good job of trying to take what Herodotus says with a grain of salt and try to link it up with other sources to get that true picture of who Xerxes was.
Yeah, it's so well said. And I think probably a couple of key takeaways just to make it really pointed for our listeners. So there is a huge dependence on Greek narratives, and that's largely because the Persian records are somewhat quote unquote silent. And we'll talk about that. So we are very much, or we have been very dependent on Greek accounts, especially Herodotus. So he does have kind of this disproportionate influence over how Xerxes and the war are remembered. And in many ways, these Greek narratives frame this very classic conflict that's moral, dramatic, and very ideologically kind of driven. Freedom versus tyranny, moderation versus hubris, civilization versus barbarism. More or less, it's that us versus them motif that we see a lot throughout history. We still see it today. And I think the key thing to take away here is that our understanding of Xerxes has often been filtered through Greek cultural storytelling, not Persian self-representation. And when we look at Herodotus, he's a very unique individual in history. Now, the histories that he wrote are obviously amazing resources for anyone who's trying to study the ancient world. But there is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to take it with a grain of salt. He offers us vivid scenes of Persian war councils, debates between Xerxes and his co-leads, dreams and omens compelling the king towards war. These are things that are just like dramatized. There is absolutely no way in my mind that Herodotus would have been able to like actually and factually report on any of these things, because modern historians do tell us that Herodotus had absolutely no access to the Persian inner court discussions. The scenes that he often represents in the histories are kind of literary constructions. They're not transcripts per se. So how Herodotus explains their perception of Xerxes or how they understood the war isn't reflective how Persians actually decided it. And this kind of goes into a broader question about what is history. And I think for many of us, it's all about recorded history. And then if you kind of double click on that and think about what does it mean to be recorded, we often say that history starts when we started writing things down. Anything before that is considered prehistory. But that's a very Euro-Western centric way of looking at recording things. If we look at Persia, for example, the question often comes to historians or people who are interested is that why don't Persians have a narrative history? And it's a great contrast with the Greek tradition. And there's deep cultural differences in each civilization and how they conceived memory and authority. So the Greeks wrote history. There was inquiry into causes, contingencies, human motives, and this is exemplified through Herodotus. But for the Persians, by contrast, events were authorized, not explained. And this comes from this divinity of kingship. Their worldview kind of dictated this. Order existed because the king restored it. The king doesn't necessarily need to tell a story because he already proclaims a sense of legitimacy. So history is more of a monument when we're looking at Persian history versus a narrative. So that's why you'll see things like inscriptions like the Behestun, the Deva, things we talked about in our previous episodes. You'll see relief art like the Persepolis staircase or tomb iconography to show the king before the sacred fire under like religious symbols of Ahura Mazda. So these were kind of, you could call them like performative texts in a way. They don't really explain with like deep analysis or storytelling, but they declare things. There are no defeats, no doubts, no learning curves. There is no before and after, only the stability of the king and the favor of the god. So I think that kind of helps ground not only how Persian history was recorded at the time, but again, you can imagine if you're a historian who's trying to study Persian history and ancient Persian history at a very high academic level, you can't just rely on recorded histories or the documented word, because that's not how the Persian Empire really functioned or saw recording history as valuable.
Yeah, it certainly makes it difficult for historians, but I thought it was so interesting when you were talking about the stability of the empire and this divine element. When we look at a lot of the things we talked about in the last few episodes around, the reliefs that Darius is creating, or even Cyrus with some of the works that he's putting out, there is this emphasis on crushing of rebellions. They love to show people revolting up and just being utterly crushed. And it really goes to that stability piece. And then you see in a lot of the transcriptions as well, there's always that piece of, they're Zoroastrian, right? So the Zoroastrian god is Ahura Mazda, and there's always this, Ahura Mazda gave me this mandate or chose me, or even when Cyrus takes Babylon, he gets the Babylonian god to kind of give him that divine right. And so it is kind of this like divine right of kings in a different spin on it. But this is, I think you hit the nail on the head there of, really, when we look at what the Persians are talking about, they are talking about this. They're not going to talk about, like you said, the debate on why did we crush this rebellion and who was going on. No, it was crushed and we were supported by the gods. So let's move on, right? And so that's what makes this so difficult, but also so interesting at the same time, because we kind of get to take the Greek perspective. We get to take the Persian view of it, and then you get to dump all the archaeology on top of that as well, and you can start to get a picture of who some of these people were. But let's get into Xerxes, because I think a lot of that is going to start to come out, and I think we set a good balance here of, we're going to tell stories directly from Herodotus, partially because they're awesome, some of them, and why not tell them? And we can go, hey, it may not be true, but let's tell fun stories. And then we'll also try to bring in a lot of those Persian sources as well. So Xerxes is born in 519 BC. He's the son of Darius the Great, so who we talked about last time, and he's also the daughter of Queen Atossa, and so she's actually the daughter of Cyrus the Great. And so this is a huge piece for legitimacy, because as we talked about last time, Darius's connection to Cyrus was murky at best, but now Xerxes got a direct line to Cyrus through Cyrus's daughter and his mother. And so now he has this dual lineage and kind of got this really great bloodline, if you will, that's going to really hammer home his claim to the throne. So Darius has a lot of kids. So when Darius took power, he just started marrying everybody he could get his hands on, because this is the way things worked back then. You could have many, many wives, and it was great for a stability standpoint, but he's quite frankly pumping out kids, not him personally, but there's a lot of sons that are coming out of this. So Xerxes has a ton of, full brothers and a ton of half brothers all around this time. So as Darius is kind of ending his life, he chooses a successor, and he chooses Xerxes. Now, Xerxes isn't the oldest son. It's not anything certainly special about where he is in the lineage. Well, having the direct line to Cyrus definitely helps, but he's chosen by Darius amongst all of his other sons, which I think matters, because Darius, as even Herodotus says, very smart guy, very good at understanding the dynamics of empire, and he chooses Xerxes. And that's a big deal, I think, from just having Darius's stamp of approval. But also Xerxes' mother definitely has a big influence here. She's very, very influential in the court, very influential with Darius, and someone that Darius clearly respected and trusted. So her influence is clearly very important. And obviously, being a mother, she wants one of her sons to be in power, but she also has multiple kids. Choosing Xerxes as well is important. So I think it's important to just take that in mind, that, when we talk about Herodotus' view of Xerxes as this arrogant man-child, that almost falls apart immediately, just because from what we know about Darius, unless Darius was completely duped and was losing his mind during the end of his life, to choose Darius, who's almost 35 by the time he takes power, tells you enough about what he thought about Xerxes, and definitely thought he was someone who could continue his legacy.
And maybe just for our listeners, I know we kind of breezed by Queen Atossa quickly, but she is a fascinating character in the princely court of Xerxes and just Persian history in general. I think she's one of the most consequential figures, because she's the daughter of Cyrus the Great. Daughter of Cyrus, married Darius, and then gave birth to Xerxes. So I think in one of the pieces of research that I was reading. I think it's from the book Persians, The Age of Great Kings. I hope I don't misquote this. It was like he said that she had a royal womb because of how her lineage was kind of portrayed throughout Persian history. And just, obviously there's the tying between relationships between these great rulers, but she also had a lot of influence in the court. So I know we talk a lot about male leaders here, but I think just an honorable mention to Queen Atassa, because she plays a very unique role in the court at this time and is able to kind of have some influence across this part of history.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame. And we were talking about this, I think, last week around just offline when we were chatting about there's all these great women in ancient history that you hear a little bit about and like, oh, I want to know more. And then, you find them on Wikipedia or something, and then the article just ends because we don't know much about them. But she's definitely someone where I think we can infer, but I love the royal boom quote, and someone who's got, touching all three of our Persian episodes and is really only getting a mention here for the first time, I think is maybe a little bit of a miss on our part, but I think it's important to understand, like, this is her time to shine. Xerxes is coming to power and, she's got great influence over that. And so even before he becomes king, and this just goes to show again, Xerxes is no fool. He's good at what he does and he's trusted by Darius. He's actually appointed governor of Babylonia. So this is the essentially, we'll just call them a province. They're called satraps by the Persians, but we'll just call it a province for simplicity. He's the governor for 12 years during Darius' reign of Babylonia, which has the city of Babylon, which may not be the most important city in the Persian Empire, but it's in that top tier of cities for sure. And so it's a very important place and right kind of smack dab in the middle of the empire. And so Darius has Xerxes look after this. And so 35-year-old Xerxes takes over in 486 BC when Darius passes. And it's just this very smooth transition of power. Everyone's like, yeah, no, we get it. It's Xerxes. He's been groomed for a while. We all get it. And so I think, again, this goes to show if people are like, whoa, what's happening here? This guy's super weak. This will be our time to take power, because there's always somebody looking to take power. I think it shows already that, Xerxes is no fool and he's ready to take power. But the thing that happens here is you don't really see within, the traditional Persian territory, you don't really see much uprising against him as a ruler. But anytime a king dies, every little province is going to try to take back some of that power themselves. And so we're going to start with Egypt, because Egypt forever has kind of been seen as, hey, you guys kind of do your thing. Darius was king of the Egyptians, very much still kind of like, I would say to an extent, a client state. They just kind of did their own thing. But when the Persians come calling for troops, when it's time for that tribute to be paid, it needs to happen. They weren't really a proper province under Egypt, under the Persians. But essentially, this is where the first of these uprising kicks off that Xerxes is going to have to go deal with.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting perspective on just the limits of empire, right? This is the largest empire at the time. And I think modern historians can see a pattern that obviously, if you're Xerxes, might have been hard to anticipate, but maybe the empire was approaching the limits of like manageable expansion at this point in time, just given its breadth across all the regions that it covered. But if you're looking at Egypt and kind of these edges of empire, so in the final years of Darius's reign, Egypt was long considered this kind of jewel in the empire's crown, but things began to stir. So by the time Xerxes came to the throne, the Egyptian revolt had intensified into kind of pretty much open defiance, and Xerxes had to respond pretty swiftly and decisively. But why revolt at all, right? To your point, Paul, if there is just the tributes that need to be paid, and you're kind of this client state. At this point, we've talked about Cyrus and Darius and how they're able to, honor an Egyptian tradition. Why go through the painful activity of revolting and potentially bringing the Persian army to your doorstep? So this is something I looked into a little bit. So from the Egyptian perspective, Persia was not necessarily a ruler that was considered like integrated into the, Egyptian style of governance. Persia was still it was a part of a non-pharaonic system. So obviously with the system of pharaohs in Egypt, Persia's rule and religious ideology is a bit different. The Achaemenids styled themselves as king of kings, not sons of Ra. So a very nuanced perspective here on how they saw themselves versus the Persian Empire. So through Cambyses and Darius had tried to align themselves with this kind of pharaonic tradition. They would build temples. They'd even adopt Egyptian titles. They'd mint coins with Egyptian iconography. It was kind of a surface harmony that was masking these deeper tensions. And I think there's a couple of key factors that fueled Egyptian unrest. One Egyptians, obviously religious alienation. Egyptians expected their rulers to participate in temple rituals, fund priesthoods, and venerate native gods. So any deviation, whether it's real or perceived, was kind of this destabilizing force. Xerxes, his later reputation in Egyptian tradition as a temple desecrator that we'll get into a little bit, may stem from his suppression of their autonomy or failure to fully engage in these local religious politics. The second point is around economic disruption. So Darius had implemented a empire-wide taxation system, including Egypt. While it brought administrative efficiency, it also meant systematic extraction of wealth. So anytime you're taking something from somebody, resentment can likely grow. And I don't think Egypt is any different than anyone else at this point. And again, specifically from these priestly and landholding classes who want to keep the wealth to themselves. And then this is just, I think, 2 points, Paul, that kind of get to what you were saying, which is dynastic distance. So Xerxes was not seen as a continuation of the local royal line. Despite Persian attempts to insert themselves into Egyptian dynastic history, most Egyptians have regarded him as an outsider, a foreign occupier, not a divine king. And then lastly, I think, just the opportunity. There is a power transition. There's a moment of imperial vulnerability, and we'll get into Babylon, but Egypt probably saw this as an opening, especially if they viewed the empire's new king as less anchored in Egyptian customs than anything that preceded him. So the revolt isn't just political. It could be seen as almost civilizational, pushback against a mode of kingship that didn't really speak to the same symbolic language that was still very powerful and very deeply entrenched in the Egyptian world.
Yeah, and we see that with the Egyptians, right? And Darius and Cyrus were both, they understood that, right? The importance of this religious element to it. But you're right, there's an opportunity here. People want to get rich. People want to be powerful. It's just natural human ambition. But the thing with Xerxes here, he doesn't mess around with this. He comes in and crushes this rebellion. And it takes him almost 2 years to do it. And he crushes it very harshly, for lack of a better description. And Darius was much more lenient to this, but Xerxes, he comes in, he crushes this, ravages the countryside around the Nile Delta, and he installs his brother as a satrap, essentially a provincial governor, and basically, starts the transition away from these client states into, no, you're a province now, deal with it. And that's kind of going to be the motif, I think, for kind of parts of Xerxes' reign, I would say, at this point. But you're right, going into Babylon as well. So in Babylon, we see these two pretenders to the Babylonian throne kick up, and Xerxes has to go and crush it with an army under his son-in-law. And so you'll see that with Xerxes, loves to have family members leading these sort of things. And this is where the punishments come very hard on Babylon. City fortifications are torn down, temples plundered, and a golden statue of Marduk, who's the Babylonian chief god, was destroyed or removed and brought back to Persia and eventually lost. But there's some stories too that he burned the temples down. I think that's more of a Greek account. We don't see that in some of the Babylonian sources, but nevertheless, it's a huge, oh my God moment for the Babylonians as they get absolutely crushed. And Xerxes comes in and he's very ruthless with this. And I think, again, we know some of these things from some of the Greek sources, but we definitely see it too in some of the reliefs around how, Xerxes is going to come in and he's not going to mess around. And we're going to bring order back and we're going to do it aggressively. And it's definitely a change in style, I think, from Darius. But again, we're at this point now where this empire is getting so big and stability is going to be the most important thing. And Xerxes is taking no more Mr. Nice Guy sort of approach to getting these guys back in line.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. This is definitely like a marked shift in terms of administration and governance and a break from the tradition that we've seen across Cyrus and Darius, which is we're going to absorb and on your religious traditions. Whereas with Xerxes, there is this element of religious suppression, those really horrible stories about him burning and taking down places of worship. Babylon also losing its kind of loss of status under Xerxes, whereas historically there was a distinction under Cyrus and even Darius where these elites in Babylon were integrated into imperial administration. But by Xerxes' time, many of these elites felt marginalized. And then that symbolic removal of Marduk also kind of removed Babylonian centrality from this imperial system of governance. And then I think in the same vein as Egypt, to a certain degree, there could have been some political ambition by those local elites or leaders to suggest that maybe we have our own alternative legitimacy where we don't have to rely on the Persian Empire. So I think in short, if Babylon may have felt that if the Persian compromise was broken, they had their own rights to reassert their own claim to kingship.
Definitely. And we even see here with Xerxes, he has in one of his inscriptions, and he uses the word demon here. Well, our translation is demon, but it is more of a, just kind of a way for us to understand it. It's obviously not the Christian word for demon, but he basically has in this inscription, he says, among these countries, there was a place where previously demons were worshipped. By Arua Mazda's favor, I destroyed that sanctuary of demons and proclaimed, let the demons not be worshipped. So you can see already that like part of this change, I think, from him is not coming from like, oh, I'm religious and I need to destroy this because I'm Zoroastrian and that's the number one religion. It's more of, I destroyed them because they rebelled, but at the same time, I have to have that divine element to it. And you see that right in his writings. But he continues on with, not just the religious elements, but this local kingship is essentially basically gone by this point. So it's a big policy change. And so he, Darius he saw himself as the Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Babylon, and he had the title King of Babylon, King of Egypt. Xerxes gets rid of all of those titles, and he's just simply King of the Persians and the Medes, and essentially King of Kings. He doesn't treat these as kingdoms anymore. They're essentially provinces. And so this is the end of semi-autonomy for Babylon and Egypt. So I think for Xerxes' perspective, you had a good thing going. You didn't like it. Well, now it's going to be even worse. You're not going to be able to get any autonomy. And in his eyes, I'm sure too, it's, hey, we're Persians and you're lucky to kind of be under our rule. So just because we got to move along here before we haven't even got into Greece yet. So just one last thing before we get into Greece, I want to talk a little bit about court life. So like we talked about, he's got a lot of half brothers and brothers-in-law. So they're definitely people who are making up his kind of, I would say, elites, people he can trust, generals, chief administrators, those sort of things, and also loyal friends as well. Loyalty will be shown. If you're loyal to the king, you're going to have some opportunities. But I also wanted to talk about eunuchs for a little bit here because they actually played a huge role in the Persian Empire. You see them all over the place in a variety of different roles, and you even see them coming up to very senior diplomats and people who are playing very chief roles within the empire. And so for those who don't know, a eunuch is essentially, it's really messed up, is a boy, essentially, young man, if you will, who's been castrated and lives his life as a castrated man. And they're really seen as this like third sex amongst the Persians, male, female, and eunuch. And they're seen for their honesty and their loyalty. There are some sexual elements to it as well that are there, but they play a very key role in this. And it's not necessarily something that the Persians invented. They've been around in Mesopotamia for a long time. The Assyrians had eunuchs. The Greeks do not have eunuchs, or they really just don't look kindly on the practice. And there's even a story from Herodotus, which again, take it with a grain of salt, where he claims that one of the parts of Babylon's tribute was to give 500 boys a year to become eunuchs within the Persian Empire. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but we do know that eunuchs played a really key role. And it's just an interesting thing that we see in the ancient world. And then as we get into the Roman world, eunuchs are still there. We see it even in the Greek world as well. And then eventually, I believe it was Domitian, one of the emperors from Rome, kind of says, this is kind of messed up. I think we should, we should stop doing this. And so if you're saying, oh my God, this is crazy, the answer is yes. And I think it's interesting whenever someone in the ancient world goes, I don't know if this is such a good idea. This is a little messed up. You probably know it's messed up because they did a lot of crazy things back then. So, but yeah, I think it's an interesting part of Persian court life. And these are people who ended up having really key roles within the Persian Empire and really a staple of kind of Near East culture, at this time.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to mention because they did fill the role of like administrators. They were even political intermediaries. So they weren't just, like helping within the royal court. These are people who were actually had some agency potentially at some level to act as intermediaries between the other satrapies that existed. And I think the Greek perspective is very interesting because Greek authors like Herodotus often kind of fixated on eunuchs as symbols of moral corruption, political decadence, Eastern excess, quote unquote. But really what this reveals is Greek discomfort, not necessarily Persian realities, to your point, Paul, because this is a practice that precedes the Persian Empire and also follows after the fall of the Persian Empire.
Yeah, and there's something to say about, hey, let this person rise up, but they can never really become king due to their state, if you will. They're not going to be able to have children they're just a person. They're not going to have a family. And I think you can see the mentality of, you can give them a lot of power, but even if they have ambition, it's going to always be knocked down a peg. And, maybe these are some people we can trust. And again, the trust and honesty piece comes into play. But Yeah, interesting part of their court. But moving on now, it's time to invade Greece. And I think this is where most people know Xerxes from, the Great Greco-Persian Wars. And this is kind of part two. So as a reminder, with Darius, during Darius's time, the Ionian Peninsula, so think of the western edge of Turkey, kind of onto the Aegean Sea. A lot of Greek city-states there. They rebelled, burned the city of Sardis, which was a huge, probably one of the biggest, if not most important cities in the Persian Empire, the capital of kind of the western part of the empire. And the Athenians played a big role in supporting this revolt. So Darius went into Greece. They had the big battle of Marathon. They lost. Darius had to come back and then had to deal with a revolt in Egypt before he could come back, and was kind of preparing this invasion anyways, but died. And so Xerxes picked up this coming next, since he's dealt with a lot of these rebellions. And now it's time to invade Greece. But why? Why even invade Greece? You got this massive, rich empire. What's the point? Well, there's a bunch of different theories. The main one that we get from Herodotus is he was urged by his cousin and brother-in-law, Mardonius, and other exiled Greek nobles at his court. So remember, there's a lot of Greeks in the Persian world as well. And basically they said, look, you got to avenge the Persian defeat at Marathon and the sack of Sardis. You need to punish these Greek city-states that defied your father. You even see stories around, hey, there was a Persian general that was killed and they never returned the body. Like, that's messed up. We got to destroy them. So there's a few things here. The Persians' Marathon, it meant something, but it wasn't this like, oh my God, what a crushing defeat. We got to avenge it. That's more of a Greek perspective because it was such a great victory for them. But the sack of Sardis absolutely plays a role in this. You know, you can't just be burning major Persian cities and getting away with it. So that's an element of it, but it's probably a lot of things. General expansion of the empire. You said it off the top, Richie. Empires need to expand. Darius had started to move into Europe. He had taken Thrace and Macedonia. So think of like kind of into Bulgaria and into Greece and into like northern Greece and into the modern day North Macedonia. Those are all under Persian rule today. So naturally the next step, head south and take the very rich Greek city-states. Religious reasons obviously would play a factor in this, just as everything does. But my favorite one, and I call it the theory of plentiful produce. So there's a thing with the Persians, and specifically Xerxes. They love gardens. They love nature. They're known for having these beautiful gardens in a lot of their big cities. They love trees as well as part of it. It's just all these things with nature. They have a very big respect for this, especially you growing up in areas that are probably pretty dry, a lot of desert, and to have a garden, it's kind of a luxury and it's kind of cool. And it's something that very tranquil for a lot of these guys. And we know Cyrus loved to garden, and we believe Xerxes liked to garden. We don't really have any proof of that, but it's just kind of a thing that we see. And so there's a story too that someone told Xerxes, hey, every plant in the world is able to grow in Greece. Their figs are fantastic. There's so much produce. It's just such a great place. We should go do that. And Xerxes went, oh my God, yeah, I'm all in it for the foliage and the produce. So obviously a fake story, but a fun story nonetheless. And even to go on top of this, there's this tree story, and Herodotus talks about, and this is just the ridiculousness of some of the Greek sources and like trying to really paint Xerxes and the Persians as very oriental and just like, wow, look at their wacky ways of doing things. The rumor is as soon as they crossed into Europe, Xerxes found some tree, this beautiful tree that he was smitten with. And they almost kind of make it sound like he fell in love with this tree. He would put jewels on it. He would kind of jazz it up. He had like armed guards standing around it all the time. And really they're just trying to say, look at this guy. He fell in love with a tree. How ridiculous is this guy? It's classic Persian, right? So you see all of these stories, but at the end of the day, Xerxes is invading Greek for a mix of all of these things, probably less than the produce side of things, but there's economic pressures, there's political pressures. The Greeks have been acting up and getting in Persian affairs for a long time. It's kind of the natural next step for our empire, and they're ready to go at it, and he's ready to invade. But there's a bunch of reasons, but I think to just say it's simply, because he needed to crush the Athenians, because general expansion of the empire, or there was some religious reason and he had to do it. I'm sure it's a mix of everything, but nonetheless, Xerxes is going to continue what Darius was planning for and try to crush the Greeks.
Yeah, I actually do recall that tree story. And again, it's just a perfect example of, Herodotus showcasing, Near East decadence and immorality by falling in love with a tree. But, regardless of that story, I think to your point, Paul, the why behind Persia invading Greece, there is no evidence for a single motivating cause behind the invasion. Herodotus' explanation of revenge for Athenian involvement does have a dramatic flair to it, and I think it's probably an element of it in all likelihood, but it shouldn't be taken at face value. The Persian Empire is massive at this point. Expansion, in my mind, is likely structural. Maybe there is a bit of emotional, neediness here on wanting to expand further, but the power that they're generating internally is going to create the need for further expansion. And if you look at later empires like Rome and Britain, Persia's pursuing the same thing that they did, which is rule without a defined endpoint. What do empires do? They want to grow. They want to increase their sphere of influence. The Persian Empire is no different.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Empire 101. And again, like we said before, they're writing the script on what empire is, and they want to expand. But at the end of the day, if you really think about where Persia is, to the Greeks, Persia is interested in Greece because they don't see anything else past Persia because it's so large. But they've got things going on in Central Asia. They got things going on in the Indian subcontinent, more in the Middle East. They're dealing with the Egyptians all the time and everything happening in those places. So yeah, this is it's definitely where they've chosen to spend their time. But yeah, I definitely don't think it's this obsession with Greece. And you see Herodotus and other Greek sources talking about just how Marathon and Greece and the Athenians were just always on the mind of Darius and Xerxes, and they couldn't wait to get back at them. And it's a very Greek centric way of thinking at it. But the preparations have been going on for years, and this is the thing we always have to remember: Xerxes doesn't wake up and go, "I think it's time to invade Greece. We'll leave in the morning." No, we're going to invade Greece, and we're going to do it in 2 years because we have a vast empire. We have to get troops from all over the empire. We got to get money. We got to get food. We got to get a supply chain built. We got to get a plan put together, and we've got to start doing some diplomatic work along the way to make sure that we're ready to go. So eventually they do all of that, and it's 480 BC, and they build these 2 huge pontoon bridges across the Hellespont. So the Hellespont is, if you think of modern day Istanbul, kind of is on part of the cities in Asia, part of the cities in Europe, and there's a small stretch of water in between that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. That's what he has to cross, and there's no permanent bridge at this time, so he has to build this huge pontoon bridge. And so a little bit of a shout out here for the Persian engineers. They're going to do a lot of cool stuff throughout this, and I think they're kind of unsung heroes in that Persian story. It's not Xerxes digging the trenches. It's not Xerxes building the bridges. He's ordering them, but there's some really cool engineering going on here. So he does that. And then he also has them build a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula in northern Greece, so he can kind of get around some dangerous waters that are dangerous due to their terrain, but also, or maybe not terrain, but just bad seas, bad sailing weather. But also it's somewhere where the Greeks would be able to attack them and have a pretty big advantage. So he builds this canal as well, which is super cool. But there's a story. They built this Hellespont bridge, and the first one, the waves came up and destroyed it. And Xerxes was just so angry. So what does he do? He got a whip out, and he started whipping the sea to punish it. Again, so silly, but this is Herodotus for you, and it kind of paints the picture of what he's thinking. Xerxes is just like, he's so angry, he just needs to put his royal fist at the sea, and he starts whipping it. So it's a very just silly story, but this massive army, multinational army, and you got to think Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Central Asians, Greeks as well, all part of this army marching into Greece. And the other thing too, they march across the Hellespont and they go through Thrace and Macedonia. Do they fight Macedonia? Did they fight Thrace? No, remember, this is Persian territory, Persian satraps, Persian provinces, and they've been so for a while now. And so they're very loyal to the Persians. Come on through. What do you need? How can we help? And this is, again, Macedonia, Alexander the Great is definitely a big connection here. But they cross with pretty big army. How big? Herodotus says 5 million, and that's ancient sources at its height. But I think, Richie, one of the interesting parts here is how do we even calculate how big these things are? There's a lot of different numbers going on here, but one of the interesting things is you got to feed these people and you got to give them enough water. And some of the calculations that have been done around 5 million people is just the numbers of you would have had to have just an insane amount of water and food that's not even physically possible to do. And what do you need 5 million people for? That's like a mass migration. That's not an army. So there's definitely some debate on where those numbers end up lying.
Yeah, so this is actually super interesting. A lot of historians, they have found these really neat tablets through archaeological digs that actually kind of showcase the record keeping for rations for getting the army ready. And based on those numbers, there's a couple of historians that have done some like actual numerical analysis on the breadth of the army, just based on what the ration counts were. And the counts go from, on the low end, like 60 to 70,000, all the way up to 150 to 200,000. So if you split the difference, call it 100 to 120,000 soldiers. For comparison, though, if we're looking at like, how do we actually ground that number? Because I don't know how many people have a military or like military history background. If we compare it to Napoleon's Grand Army when they invaded Russia in 1812, the estimated size of that army was 450,000 to 600,000. So what the Persian Empire is able to produce is massive in the ancient world. Like, it is an incredible feat. And it's like a visual map of an empire, which is really just demonstrating Persian sovereignty that's stretching from the Nile all the way to the Indus Valley. Like, it is an incredible feat to organize this many soldiers.
Yeah, I think that Napoleon comparison is perfect just to ground the numbers, because based on how much time we're talking about, Napoleon's essentially doing it in modern times, if you will. He's got a lot of more, let's say, just technology and an understanding of how to do supply chains properly. This is not something that the Persians, I wouldn't say that they don't know how to do. They obviously know how to do it. They've done it many times, but to do it at this scale, at this time period, it's not something that everybody knows how to do. So it's a big thing. So they've got this huge army. They're coming into Greece. And the thing that's important here is there's probably about 300 or so Greek city-states. 30 to 35 resist the Persians. So this is this trope that we need to make sure we understand. This isn't all of Greece versus all of Persia. It's some Greeks against the Persians and some Greeks as well. Some Greek city-states are like, absolutely, we will bend the knee to you, Xerxes. We understand you're very powerful. We don't want to mess with you. But some are like, forget it. And the two big ones are the Athenians and the Spartans. And that really comes together at the Battle of Thermopylae. So there's this narrow pass at Thermopylae, really tight area. Xerxes knows he's going to have to go through it, and he knows that the Greeks are going to go there. And this is one thing with the Persians. They are the kings of intelligence. They know exactly where the troops are going. They know exactly what's happening. And they're very, very good at figuring out, especially on land, what's going to be happening. So this Battle of Thermopylae is led by King Leonidas of Sparta. And so the famous story of the 300 Spartans. So there was 300 Spartans and about 7,000 Greeks altogether fighting at the Battle of Thermopylae. So it wasn't just Leonidas and his 300 Spartans against this massive Persian army, but 7,000 Greeks there. And so it is kind of annoying for Xerxes. He's not able to crush this as quickly as he maybe would like to. It does take a few days to do so. And this is important, right? Because if the Greeks can slow the Persians down, remember, they got to feed and keep the supply chain going for this massive army. And then also the Spartans are trying to hold time for reinforcements to come and all that. So in a sense, it's seen as definitely a symbolic battle for the Greeks and the Spartans specifically. They're able to hold the Persians for a few days, kind of buy themselves some time. But ultimately, the Persians are smart. Like I said, they figure out a way around the back and are able to flank the Greeks. Most of them are able to flee, and Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who are left basically try to hold what's left, and they're absolutely crushed very quickly by the Persians, and specifically the Immortals. And so the Immortals are this really cool, they're the elite of the elites of the Persians. And the reason they're called Immortals, and this is a Greek term, they were seen as having 10,000 men in their group, if you will. And the story was that they were immortals because the resources of the Persian army were so vast that as soon as one immortal was killed, another one was right there in his place. And they were just always at 10,000. So the word immortal comes in because you can't destroy them. They're always going to be at 10,000. The Persian army is always going to be adding to this. But again, that's the Greek way of looking at it. What's the Persian view on the Immortals? We have really, outside of a few drawings and kind of knowing what they look like, we really don't know much about the Immortals. In fact, we don't even know what the Persian word for immortal is. We know they existed. But again, just goes to show how much we're relying on Greek sources here. But definitely this is personal bodyguard of the king, elite, heavy infantry, a little bit different than your Greek heavy infantry, fighting a little bit of a different way, really more mobile, I would say, than the tight Greek formations. But this is the cream of the crop of the Persian army. And the Persians typically would fight horseback, lighter armored. They like to use space and speed, where the Greeks very happy to fight in tighter quarters, why Thermopylae was a good place for them to hold the line. But ultimately, so few against such a large army and the great intel of the Persians. And this is an overwhelming victory for the Persians. And now the path to Athens is wide open. So when we keep going here, this path is open. Well, they're going to Athens, and they show up, and most of the Athenians smartly have evacuated. They've buried a lot of the key relics that they have, and they've actually moved to like a small island close to Athens where they can kind of see what's going on in a distance. And the Persians come in and they don't mess around. They burn Athens and they sack it very viciously. And so think of the picture here of these Athenians sitting off on this island and just seeing the smoke and the fire and the light at night coming from the Persian city. And there's stories of Athenians are jumping off cliffs and killing themselves because they can't handle this. But again, this is a very psychological blow, but this is a huge win for the Persians. We've got revenge against the Athenians. We've burned their city. We've destroyed many of their temples. And this is incredible news. Like if the war ended right here, Xerxes would be a Persian hero. Would be no question about it on, hey, he went in, he burned Athens to the ground and he either left or stopped here, but he got revenge. If the story you believe that they're here for revenge against the Athenians, he's done it. And, it's a huge blow for the Athenians.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. If it just stopped here, I wonder what the histories would have looked like from Herodotus. But again, like it does paint a very interesting picture that almost in a way supports this like vengeful Xerxes who wants to raise things to the ground. But again, that's not unique to the Persians, right? Like this is the ancient world. Ancient leaders had to do horrible things to exercise their power. If the shoe was on the other foot, I doubt that it would have looked any different if there was another foreign power invading Persian lands. So I know it kind of feeds into the narrative that Herodotus has been spelling that we've been trying to dispel. But again, I think this is the ancient world and it is still extremely violent and you need to show and exercise power and authority. And this is not unique to Xerxes or any other, Persian leader at the time. And
if I'm a Persian, I'm saying, well, the Athenians started it. They supported the Ionian revolt that burned Sardis. Why would I not come back and do the exact same thing? So you're right. This is the way it works back then. But next step, what does Xerxes do here? Well, does he continue to attack over land and really take the larger Greeks city-states, go after Sparta? And this is the turning point really in the invasion. So there's this Strait of Salamis, and this is a big naval battle that happens. And the Persians, they had these, I would say, heavier, they call them triremes, these basically manually powered ships, a lot of oarsmen. They would try to ram other ships. That was kind of how this naval warfare went. And they're basically ready to fight the Athenians in this strait. Now, some say, well, why didn't just Xerxes continue to travel over land? That was really silly. There's some rumors that he heard that the Athenians were essentially, their alliance with the other Greek city-states was breaking apart, and he thought this was a great chance to attack. There's a story of a Greek queen who I believe I mentioned last week at the Battle of Marathon. Made a mistake. It's actually this battle where she's actually with the Persians and she's from the Ionian Peninsula, kind of Western Turkey. And she recommends waiting it out and not attacking through sea. And I love this because clearly Herodotus is going to say, Xerxes, if you just listen to this Greek woman who was with you, maybe you could have just waited things out and the Athenians would have collapsed, but you decided to attack. Should have listened to the Greek. But ultimately, historians say there's some merit to this. He has to keep the sea routes open. He can't let this Athenian navy take over because he can't support this massive army without having this sea connection. But really, it's a massive defeat very quickly. They kind of caught off guard by the Athenians. And there's a story that Xerxes kind of pitches his seat up on a cliff so he can watch the battle, almost like he's got box seats at a football game. And he sees his army utterly routed and essentially destroyed at this point. Not completely, but they lose a ton of ships and a ton of men. And so winter's coming. It's time to return to Asia. So he starts to make his way back. He leaves forces in Greece under a general and kind of starts that retreat. And then there's the following year, as Xerxes is retreated, the troops that he's left fight another battle and they lose. Even this general that he leaves behind is defeated. And so it's kind of like, oh boy, invasion is not only done, but it's kind of looking embarrassing now. And so there's some more skirmishes and stuff. But after 479 BC, Xerxes has had enough, essentially, with Greece. He doesn't try to go back. And so Persian expansion is checked. He's gone back and he still burned Athens. And I'm sure the story is, hey, we burned Athens down. We got revenge. We did what we did. But ultimately, the empire does not expand and it's come at great cost.
Yeah, and I think this is where there's a lot of interesting like historical research and analysis on what happens. So yes, he lost 100%. And modern historians actually see the Greek invasion as like kind of the zenith of Persian imperial ambition. So after this loss, Xerxes, his focus on the empire kind of turns inward. The western edge is held, but it's no longer going to be advanced on. So the empire, to your point, Paul, has been checked. So in this light, the war becomes more of a clash of armies. It was a test of imperial reach, of whether a sprawling, diverse empire built on tribute and hierarchy could absorb a world of fractious, independent city-states. And the answer ultimately for Xerxes was no.
And it makes sense if you're the Persians and what you see after. The Greeks, they're always fighting each other, and that's what comes next. And for the Persians, like, this is fantastic. Let them deal with their own problems. Almost thank God we didn't get into this mess, right? And they actually support from a distance. But you're right. Xerxes really turns inward here, and this is where he focuses more on his administration. And I think part of it is he probably senses that his seat is a little bit weaker now because he hasn't been able to have these great military campaigns. And I'm sure he's going through the propaganda and those sort of things to spin this up. But ultimately, it's a defeat and it's something he's going to need to deal with. So what do you do when you want to show that you're powerful? Build a lot of cool stuff. And so he does a lot of things throughout the empire, and we're not going to get into too many details, but one of the coolest things is he builds something called the Hall of 100 Columns in Persepolis, and it's this massive building with 100 columns, 12 meters high, unbelievable architectural marvel at the time. So he actually didn't finish it. His son actually had to finish it just based on how big and of a process this was, but he really kickstarted it and signed off on the design and all those sort of things. So a lot of cool stuff that he's kind of building and really focusing on internally. So Persepolis is continuing to grow into the marvel of the ancient world and really showing Persian strength and dominance at this time. And even we've started to see some things in the histories around, like, Greeks and different Egyptians and people from all over the empire who are actually at Persepolis building. So again, this is an empire-wide initiative. But the next thing that kind of happens is there's some shift in court dynamics. So the Greek historians say, he's starting to sit back and be more kind of in his court, throwing lavish banquets, and, he's really starting to be into luxuries, but now he's starting to get really depressed and he's turning inward and he's lost that energy. We don't know for sure, but we do know that he's spending more time internally and trying to build out the empire. And this is where we get some interesting stories. And again, whether this is true or not, we don't know, but it's one of those stories that we're going to tell nonetheless. So we're calling it his principal wife, because you have to remember these Persian kings had many wives. So her name is Amestris. And she basically is a daughter of one of Darius' trusted nobles, married Xerxes, very powerful lady. And so according to Herodotus and many Greek accounts, she's very strong-willed and could be really ruthless. And so Xerxes famously was entangled in some affair with the wife of his brother, and this essentially ends disastrously. So his wife finds out about this, basically creates some sort of story for Xerxes that basically shows her as planning a revolt or planning to kind of take over and using him in a certain way. And he basically gives his wife, all right, go deal with it. And this is the ancient world. And she basically brutally not her personally, but she has people brutally mutilate this person he's having an affair with by essentially cutting off various parts of her body and making her kind of very disfigured, and then executes her entire family. So even Xerxes' brother-in-law, like, it's just very messed up. And so she's very vengeful and she has this sway over the inner circle. But I think it's enough. This story at least just represents the court is not a stable place. There's a lot of backstabbing going on. There's a lot of messed up stuff, and it really ties into what's coming next. So whether the story is true or not, I think it represents that all is not maybe smooth and clean within Xerxes' court, and it'll foreshadowing essentially what's about to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there is a market break here with our previous two episodes with Cyrus and then Darius, where there is a focus on expansion, east and west, north and south, as much as possible to grow the empire. And obviously with the failure on Xerxes' part in the Greek invasion, he becomes more of a, I don't know if custodian is the right word, but that's the word that's coming to mind right now, of a very mature imperial system. He is portrayed in the Greek perspective as becoming lethargic, lazy, unmotivated. But Persian sources actually say the exact opposite. He focused on prioritizing order, continuity and legitimacy by focusing more inwards. This is a, markedly distinct vision of kingship that's centered on hierarchy, stability, and this kind of, king of kings divine mandate rather than personal legacy or historical memory. But then when we really zoom in on the interworkings of the imperial court, it really begs the question, what is going on here? To your point, Paul, like that seems to be a lot of instability and fractiousness between the highest people of the court, even though we have Persian sources that are telling us that, Xerxes, has been looking inwards to have some more stability. So there's a bit of a balancing act here that I think historians are having to make. And, for our part, we just get to report on it. But I think there's two sides of a coin here. And I know where you're going with the next step, but it really does paint a very kind of obtuse picture of Xerxes on what his actual goal and intention was.
And it's really interesting with Cyrus, they were nomadic. With Darius, they were mobile-ish. And you're starting to see Xerxes a little bit more settled here. It's interesting now that, if you settle people in a court, does everyone just kind of go a little bit crazy? But at least when you're moving around, there's other things to worry about. And I always just like to think of that around how some of that stuff works. But yeah, it's time for Xerxes to leave us. And our last two episodes either died in battle, we think, or died peacefully. But Xerxes is assassinated in August of 465 BC after 21 years as reigning the empire as king of kings. So there's a coup essentially by a high-ranking court official who is the commander of the royal bodyguard and his eunuch chamberlain. So again, eunuchs are coming back and playing a key role in this. They essentially stabbed Xerxes to death. The story goes he was sleeping or he was just in a vulnerable state. So he's 54. He's dead now. And essentially this turns into an immediate power struggle. This royal bodyguard tries to seize power. The court goes into chaos. This royal bodyguard does assert some control, but within months, Xerxes' younger son basically rallies some troops, takes this guy out, and installs himself as, the next emperor within just about a year of the Persian Empire. But that is the end of Xerxes. And I think it's interesting because, like we said, clearly something was going on here where there was enough for an assassination to happen. But you never know with these things. This also could have just been two guys poorly planning something because clearly they weren't able to keep control for very long. That's the ancient world. Assassinations of emperors and kings, happen every day, it sounds like, but that's the unfortunate ends of Xerxes. But his royal line continues on. The line of Cyrus continues on, and the Persian Empire continues to move on.
And I think something worth note, I don't know if you mentioned it, Paul, but this was the first time an Achaemenid king had been murdered in such a coup. So this actually breaks the line of peaceful successions from Cyrus through Darius.
To an extent, I think, right? Because we don't know what happened with Cambyses exactly.
Sure. Yes,
so
good point.
There's the whole weird thing with Darius and his story, but yes, I would say you're right. On an official, if we're looking at the official sources, yes, he's absolutely the first that wasn't peaceful. But it's kind of crazy if you think about it, right? Like how long they've been around for multiple generations that we really haven't had this string of assassinations and really you have this peaceful Persian time. And I think what's even more interesting is everyone goes, well, Xerxes, that loss in Greece, this is when the Persian Empire started to decline. That's one of the most false things I think that we can get out of this. The Persian Empire remains very strong and stable for probably another 150 years. And we've done enough Roman history to see all the craziness that happens there. The Romans being peaceful for 150 years is basically considered like it was the Pax Romana, the peaceful Roman times, right? So you do see really strong, stable empire for a while, and you got it for another 150 years until Alexander shows up. And again, it takes someone like Alexander to take out the Persians. But when we look at his, I would say, legacy, within the Persian sources, he's seen as a very strong leader, someone who did very well, kept the empire stable, and the gods pleased. That's what you want out of a leader. What more could you really ask for? And I think that's kind of the way, outside of maybe keeping the gods pleased, because I'm not too familiar with what that means from their perspective, but kept the empire stable, did what he needed to do, put down rebellions. Seems like a pretty good king all around. Yeah, he failed in Greece partially. He was able to get revenge against Athens, but wasn't able to take Greece. I still find it interesting just on how poorly of an image he has, but we know who to thank for that.
Yeah, I think this image is so unfair, right? So I think in terms of his legacy, I just have a couple notes here to close off with. There's two historically different perspectives, right? If you look at the Persian perspective, he's a legitimate, pious ruler who upheld imperial order that was established by Cyrus and then Darius. Persian inscriptions and monuments emphasize his continuity. There's no denying that. The Greek perspective is a little bit different. He is kind of cast as this archetypal, despotic, oriental ruler. He's arrogant, he's decadent, and, he's ultimately humbled by Greek freedom. But when you look at modern scholarship, this is an attempt to rebalance the picture by integrating Persian administrative records, archaeology, and then Near Eastern evidence alongside Greek narratives. And I think modern historians reveal an empire that continued to function effectively under Xerxes, with a lot of economic activity, massive construction projects, very effective administration at scale, even after military setbacks. And I think most historians now largely reject older notions that Xerxes kind of marked the beginning of imperial decline. Instead, they view him as a capable ruler operating within the constraints of a mature empire. And I think I agree with that. Based on everything I've read over the last week or so, I think that's a very well-balanced approach and viewpoint to have of Xerxes if you're going to take anything away from this episode.
Yeah, there's something about the ancient world where these people who are able to just keep things stable and keep things moving don't really get enough love, I feel. We have you're the expansionist, you're the great, you've been adding to the empire, or you're this crazy guy who's bankrupt the empire. But there's all these emperors and kings who, some guys you don't even know of, oh yeah, they lasted for 22 years and just kept things chill. And obviously the Greek element of this makes Xerxes so important to the whole Persian story. But there are many, whether it's in Greece, whether it's in Rome, whether it's in Persia, where you just see these guys coming, yeah, everything was cool. They did what they did. Economy was good. People were happy, and we move on, right? And so, not to say Xerxes is a boring leader by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like that part of him is kind of overlooked for, hey, he failed in Greece, and if you can't expand your empire, what's the point? So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there on just kind of who Xerxes was. And again, he doesn't get the great term, and I think maybe you do have to conquer some territory to be a great, but definitely a very capable, very strong leader that I think kept the Persian Empire going. And when your empire is this big, it can really only do one thing, is collapse. And until that happens, Xerxes, I don't think really plays much, if any, a role in doing that. Awesome. So I think this wraps up our journey into Persian history. So we'll be back with something new in a couple of weeks. So hope you all enjoyed the 3 episodes that we did. And we'll be back in a few weeks with something new. So we'll see you then.
It's been a fun journey. Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, just a quick thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way to go deeper is with our History in Motion Dispatch, a free newsletter where we share episode notes, maps, and the reading list behind our research. You'll find the link in the show notes. And if you've got a question, a topic suggestion, or something you'd like us to unpack in future episodes, email us directly. We will read every message, and we hope many of our future episodes will start with your questions. We're also running a history book giveaway, usually one of the books we actually used while researching the show. Details will also be included in the newsletter. And if you haven't already, make sure you're following the show on Spotify. It helps more people discover the History in Motion podcast. Thanks again for spending your time with us. History doesn't move on its own. People carry it forward.